Oi, giving up on consciousness as the ghost in the machine. This is a cool paper today. Usually I'm an AI channel. Today it's more philosophy. It's not very difficult. The central thesis here being there is an illusion that we tend to think we cause, like our consciousness and our own thoughts cause our body to do things and our own behavior. But these authors argue other way around. Actually, your subconscious creates thoughts for you to experience and you have no say in the matter, basically. Really cool stuff going on here. Obligatory disclaimer. Let's say I'm a 4 stars for today or so. Before we get started, like, subscribe, comment, all the YouTube things. Join the Discord server to discuss. Support with that YouTube join button down below, as low as $1 a month. And if you do, you get early access to my videos before everyone else does. Thank y'all for watching. Let's get to it. Starting off with a beautiful quote, a word worn smooth by a million tongues. There are many theories of consciousness, but none that are widely accepted. Now, we're going to define here today phenomenal consciousness versus access consciousness. The first one, phenomenal, is the first person, immediate, and non reflective experience of sensations, which describes feelings, perceptions, thoughts, wants, and emotions, inaccessible to an external observer and not requiring further justification. Now, I would state that the actual feelings, perceptions, emotions, wants, etc., themselves are not the consciousness thing. They are just the things being experienced by said phenomenal consciousness. And there's access consciousness, however, is characterized by reportable representational content and involves the ability to self monitor and engage cognitive functions such as reasoning and movements for direct control of action or speech. So this is a weird definitions we have. This access one seems to be more along the lines of like what can be talked about or experienced or engaged in or just acted upon that is actually in some way verifiable by outside people, can be out or accessed by outside consciousnesses, which only involves reasoning, uh, things you can do involving movement, right? Whereas your actual emotions cannot be directly accessed. And this consciousness comprises of at least 3 related features in this paper. The first one is the experience of subjective awareness, which is a component, or I'd say the primary component of P consciousness as previously defined. The next one is awareness of self together with the perceived volitional capacity to make decisions and control actions, a component also of P consciousness. So one of these, the first one, is just like the very fact of being able to experience subjectively, which personally I would state even like a rock might have. The second one is the ability to not only experience and perceive, but also to, in some degree, make decisions in your environment. And then the third and final one is the awareness of psychological states such as thoughts, attention, perception, intentions, memories, and emotions. So, and we're talking about the awareness of those states, not just having those states, it seems. This is a good point, too. Phenomenal awareness in different domains should be sharply distinguished from modular systems that operate on linguistic, perceptual, and other kinds of information. I interpret this as saying, like, the actual algorithms and things that your neurons are doing in your head to take out actions are not the same thing as your subjective feeling of consciousness, of awareness, of sentience, or whatever you want to call it. This paper wants to challenge the primacy of the conscious centric account. Until quite recently in the history of science and philosophy, mental life was considered entirely or mainly conscious in nature. For example, Rene Descartes' Cogito ergo sum and John Locke's mind first cosmology. The primacy of conscious thought for how people historically have thought about the mind is illustrated today in the words we use to describe other kinds of processes. All are modifications or qualifications of the word conscious, i.e., unconscious, preconscious, subconscious, non-conscious. This is a weird thing to think about, is from my point of view anyways, it seems like Western philosophy and thought has this quality and that Eastern does not necessarily. In a lot of Eastern traditions, they have much more awareness of this idea that you are not your thoughts. They are just part of the environment in which you are in, just like the actual chair you're sitting in. Whereas in the West, we're very egocentric, very me, I, and we identify with the ego. We think we are the actual mask with which we wear, and it seems like we tend to see these pieces of us, these the unconscious, the preconscious, our personality traits, our feelings. We identify with them. We look at them and we strictly hold them to ourselves, and we make them part of our identity, right? Hence why they referenced two Western philosophers there, and this is, of course, a paper coming from modern Western accounts, whereas my personal impression is that sufficient Eastern exposure would have you doing this less so and really stripping away most of those little aspects of consciousness and saying those are not actually part of the fundamental thing we're talking about here. So, in a prior paper, the authors argued that this traditional conscious centric account, although experienced as real, is from a science perspective wrong headed, and that a more detailed consideration of everyday phenomenological experience and evidence from cognitive neuroscience suggests that, however compelling, suggested, sorry, that however compelling first person experience is, consciousness has no explicit causal function, and that this functional attribution relies on a powerful intuitive false belief, albeit one we are all strongly adapted to maintain. So, the fundamental claim of this paper is that we tend to think of consciousness as causing all of the other parts of our mind, and that their position here today is actually it's probably the other way around. Consciousness is more of a backseat driver than it is an actual cause for the different aspects of our minds. In another prior paper, the authors presented a detailed account arguing that non conscious neural causation provided a more plausible, albeit non intuitive basis to explain both the experience of consciousness and the contents of consciousness. We consider that subjective awareness provided no functional or causal impact upon psychological outputs or actions other than appearing contemporaneously with those psychological events as experienced. So they were doing experiments basically where they said, okay, we are going to try and look at the timing both out here in the real world and in the brain of various phenomenon, such as asking the patient to react to something, to some stimulus, right? And what they found was that by the time that information of stimulus had actually reached the patient's brain or the specific circuits that are usually associated with conscious awake awareness, uh, by that time, the let's say neurons or whatever in your hand and your motor system was already acting. It seemed like the causal relationship that we perceive with why we do things and how we do things did not match up with the actual timing of looking at different different structures in the brain and different other parts of your total autonomous nervous system and everything. So, as all cognitive functions attributed to consciousness must derive from underlying neural machinery that give rise to them in the brain, we argue that to avoid the endless vacillation between first and third person perspectives when explaining human psychology from a scientific perspective, we suggest that subjective awareness, consciousness, possesses no cognitive function, i.e., has no functional utility separate from the brain any more than there is a specific category of digestive process that exists separate from the physicality and workings of the gut. So they're saying here it does not seem like consciousness is some separate thing that gets to control the brain and has some other use. It seems like we really have to assume scientifically that consciousness must be a result of whatever the brain is doing, and could even be a byproduct result of that. Despite this, most of us feel compelled to believe that when we make a voluntary action, we do not feel as though it has simply happened, but rather instead feel as though we are responsible for the action. There was a crazy paper. I want to say it was Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, back in I want to say 2010 maybe, psychology paper, where he posited this theory. I'm probably butchering it. That basically said it seems like a good metaphor for how our conscious awareness works is that our consciousness is a person riding an elephant. And I wasn't aware of this, but apparently elephants are notoriously difficult to actually steer. They just don't care where you want to go and they'll go wherever they want to go. And the idea being that the person up top, on top of the elephant riding it, is in denial about the fact that they're not in control and is insisting, oh, the elephant definitely turned right just there because I wanted it to turn right just there because I wanted it to, right? Um, the other uh idea would be the other metaphor, sorry, the paper was that of a dog wagging its tail or of a tail wagging the dog. He said that for a conscious person to assume that their consciousness is the thing causing their behavior would be like for a dog's tail to presume that it is the thing causing the dog to shake back and forth vigorously. No, 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 no. The dog is excited about something and therefore its tail is shaking. It is not the other way around. The idea here being that consciousness is probably a secondary thing that gets added on after the fact, that is like a piece of the puzzle that is not actually causal of the whole being in total. As such, our account can be seen to support Ryle's critique of the concept of a ghost in the machine as some form of qualitative, distinctive, intervening mysterious state separate from the neural machinery and comprising cognitive representations, providing for agentive and control processes. So that was a lot. Basically, traditional thoughts often have consciousness as a ghost in the machine, as some separate, powerful thing controlling said machine, a ghost in the machine. And we're saying here, no, that's silly. Thoughts and behavior are caused by brain activity, but being byproducts of the neural activity have no causal efficacy for our behavior or on the activity of the brain itself. So it's not that you think things and therefore you do things, it's that your underlying neural circuitry is doing things and those thoughts are popping into your head because they have already been happening and been being carried out by the majority of your brain that's actually doing this. The conscious part of your brain that is experiencing thoughts be thrown into it is just experiencing them. It is not itself using them to cause the rest of the brain's activity. This is something that becomes much more apparent to you if you do a lot of meditation. This feeling of, oh wow, it really starts to get this sensation of these thoughts just kind of appear in my head. You lose the sense of control of your own thoughts that you get through false identification with those thoughts, and you start to realize, oh, I am something less than that. These thoughts are themselves my environment, the exact same way this chair and my computer are part of my environment that I am within. Now they're getting into what they're calling the Oakley-Halligan model. That's the author's names. So based on experience from a range of psychological and neuropsychological phenomena, including striking disassociations between what patients report verbally and what they can respond to behaviorally. For example, visual neglect, whatever anosognosia is, hypnosis, suggestion, placebo, amnesia, blind sight, hysteria, phantom limbs, etc. There's a bunch of these weird conditions that kind of destroy our traditional thoughts about what consciousness is and how it works causally. After looking at all those conditions, the authors concluded that psychological content experienced in subjective awareness is generated by and within the non conscious brain systems in the form of a continuous self referential personal narrative. So, when you look at something like hypnosis, for example, the idea that your consciousness causes what your body and everything else of your person does becomes silly when you experience hypnosis and go, wow, the that that was a very that experience was a very incongruent with what was actually like I usually think is happening in my head. And so all of these little examples they're giving, they're not going to dive into too deeply here, but all have the same phenomenon of not fitting in with the theory of consciousness causing behavior, and instead all of these psychological phenomena make more sense the moment you start to think, what if brain activity itself just creates consciousness as a extra little thing on top that need not necessarily always be happening. Some prior study by someone named Wegner presents a compelling series of cases where people feel they are willing and act when they are not, such as in phantom limbs and ear wiggling, or when they feel they are not willing and act or experience when they are in fact initiating, such as auditory hallucinations, automatic writing, the some kind of pendulum effect, dowsing. If you don't know what dowsing is, it's when you use an object to kind of psychic hippie style find something, most commonly using metal rods and how they tilt in your hands and point to supposedly find wells with water in them. It's one of the most common ones. Idiomotor actions, particularly in the context of hypnosis, which can produce that the feeling that your actions are happening to you rather than that you are doing to them. Why is it phrased that way? That's gross. But yeah, all of these experiences have the same theme of making you feel as if your actions are happening to you rather than you are controlling them. So the authors propose that this continuously updated narrative, like your actual sense of self, your narrative, arises from the internal broadcasting of selective outputs of cognitive processing, sensory information, and motor control. The idea here being different parts of your brain and body, whatever, are making decisions and broadcasting their decision all to a central narrative hub, which is the actual conscious thing. And so, hence why your thoughts are just part of your environment. You are literally picking up on the broadcasts from different parts of your being. People who talk about consciousness being fractal and split up into many little parts, that's kind of related to here, is this idea of you are composed of many subcomponents that themselves have their own agency and ability to act, hence why you, for example, can't control your heartbeat. Some of those subcomponents you probably have varying degrees of post hoc control over, but overall, it seems like in general, you are mostly viewing these incoming broadcasts and creating a narrative based on them rather than actually being the control center. You are more of a news reporter than you are the captain up on deck, per se. The personal narrative that we as individuals are familiar with forms the basis for autobiographical memories, but critically also serves the powerful evolutionary function that enables us to communicate the content of our internal broadcasting, all of which allows recipients to generally potentially mutually adaptive, to generate potentially mutually adaptive strategies. This is a huge hypothesis in the consciousness space of like the whole of the reason that we evolved consciousness from the get-go being for social purposes, such that we can broadcast our internal state, our internal thoughts and feelings to others, and therefore coordinate with others. We argue that it is the capacity to communicate the contents of these personal narrative either as knowledge or beliefs to other minds and not personal awareness per se that confers individual evolutionary advantage. So they're saying the awareness of yourself probably wasn't the thing that came first, or let's just say it wasn't the thing that was actually useful evolutionarily. The thing that was useful was probably the ability to communicate with other humans that your personal narrative gave you, and then maybe post hoc just as a byproduct, maybe post hoc as a new, also useful thing. Your actual self awareness was then built on top of that. Once you become aware of others and communicating with others, eventually it also makes sense to become aware of yourself as well. The core central executive structure, they're getting into their actual model and everything now, which it annoys me to all hell psychologists making graphics for models and things, because they never actually like correspond to something the way you'd expect from like a computer science graphic or a math diagram or something. It's always just nonsensical shapes. So frustrating. Anyways, the core central executive structure is a functional collection of neurological systems used to coordinate and select psychological products from different brain systems, mediating attention, perception, memory, reasoning, language, problem solving, planning, theory of mind, and the search for meaning. So your actual central executive structure, your narrative that gets built, your self awareness, your consciousness, is just meant as a hub for all of those things to be communicated. The CES is responsible for creating the continuously updated personal narrative from components of brain activity considered most relevant for an ongoing task. The process of creating the personal narrative we describe as internal broadcasting. The personal narrative is accompanied passively by subjective experience, aka personal awareness. Within this model, PA, unlike the non conscious neuropsychological processes, is epiphenomenal, meaning just a byproduct, and its neural origins remain to be determined by further scientific research into compatible neurocognitive processing systems. So, under this idea, they're saying self-awareness is just likely a byproduct of the original need to communicate in a hub type manner to other beings, and that the actual sense of subjective experience is they're gonna throw like kick that rock down the hill and say it's to be determined, I guess. Personally, my belief is that the subjective experience part, this like most core level, when you strip back all the components of consciousness, this part of it is actually just had by everything. I think there is a thing for which it is like to be even an electron, however simple that is. However, our subjective experience is obviously very complex, given this narrative that the CES creates. Accordingly, personal awareness (PA) is not able to influence the brain processes associated with it. That's quite the take. I totally agree. Most of the time, it is not able to influence the brain process associated with it. But I would counter. I really do think that sometimes it can. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and I think it's in a way by saying that it can, you're also saying that it's not, because it's more like a feedback loop if that makes more sense. But I have yet to fully work out my thoughts on this subject. An important feature of CES activity is that it also be able to select some contents from the personal narrative for transmission to other individuals, primarily by speech in humans, but also via writing, gestures, and other nonverbal media. This second transmission process we refer to as external broadcasting. This facilitates social collaboration and the creation of a cultural store of ideas, skills, and information. See, the reason I think it's important to note that to some degree it must be possible for that the narrative structure, the actual self-awareness, sense of self, to influence the brain in return, is because what would be the point of a bunch of beings who all have internal broadcasting and all can external broadcast to others, but cannot take in information from said external broadcasts and use it to adjust their own internal brain, right? There has to be some degree to which this broadcasting between beings is useful, and it is useful because when I hear you tell me something, I can now incorporate that information back into those subconscious brain systems. An understandable objection to the phenomenological account is that as human beings, we have developed extensive social and legal governance structures that explicitly assume a conscious centric account that actively promotes and accepts the case for individual responsibility, mental causation, and self directed actions. To substantiate the belief in free will, meaning the power or capacity of a self to choose among alternatives and to act situations independently of biological and social restraints. So, to substantiate the belief in free will, one could argue that one needs to hold with the belief that humans have conscious centric mediated systems designed for self-directed voluntary abilities. So what I said a second ago about how you have to some degree, be able to further control or at least influence your own brain with the things that you think or that you hear from others. In other words, the concept of consciousness is needed to express the delusion of free will. Yeah, they're getting into the whole legal thing here of we've based the whole legal system around this kind of thing. If you want my thoughts on free will, I'm gonna link a video at least in the description. It might be like one of the pop-ups at the end of this video too, about my thoughts on the fundamentally incorrect way that the question of free will is phrased. We argue that belief in free will and personal responsibility evolved as protective social constructs. Yeah, totally. The study of psychology needs to keep in mind that in nature, the unconscious mind tends to be the rule and not the exception, meaning every other animal like functions very well off of an unconscious mind. The idea that like we are suddenly the exception is kind of silly. It's more reasonable to believe a much smaller role of our unconscious mind than it is to believe that like, oh, not only was this new system in our brain developed, but it also was immediately given control over all the things the subconscious mind used to handle. That's the silly part. Um, Generally in nature, in evolution, you don't see complete like destruction of old things and replacement with new things. What you see is slow over time adaptations of old things for new purposes, right? Does that make sense? And so for to say that like, oh, the day the first monkey became conscious, that like they big parts of their brain just stopped handling certain things is pretty silly. I do think, however, I really do think that there is a degree to which like you know how you become aware of something like right now because I said so, your tongue is now uncomfortable in your mouth, right? Because I made you aware of it. Now you're like, what the heck? Or suddenly you are now aware that you can see your nose in your field of view. Boom, you can see your nose now, right? I think there's a degree to which, because your internal narrative, your consciousness, does have at times when it wants to or when it just gets stuck with it, some control, some awareness of various body systems. There's a degree to which a lot of people, given our whole obsession with the ego here in the West, do too much letting their consciousness, their ego control their things, and not enough letting their subconscious do it. So my big example was when I was living out west, right? I was going surfing with some friends. We went surfing, and the place we went to, it was a military base, San Onofre, if you've been there, and like the beaches, trestles and whatnot. Where we parked was very far from a couple of the beaches we want to go to, right? So we had to walk like I think it was 6 miles out, 6 miles back total that we did. And on part of the beaches, some of them were like very, very rocky and like not fun on your feet. And we were just wetsuit and board, didn't bring anything else with us, right? And so my buddies were walking and having a not fun time. Bloody feet, getting their feet really knocked up, having trouble walking, like tiptoeing around these rocks and things, right? Meanwhile, I had figured out previously that if you don't look at the ground in front of you, you instead look straight ahead and you kind of let your lower peripheral vision see things and adapt to things, and you let your legs do what they do, and not only step blindly, but also like step with like I guess with faith a little bit, and you kind of let your internal monkey brain handle that stuff. It's very good at stepping correctly, even in a terrible, rocky, covered with barnacles, uh, dangerous, stub your toe, cut your foot beach, right? I managed to get through that entire, I think it was almost 12 miles of walking that day, carrying a surfboard on my head, uh, with my feet being totally fine, and all my buddies had at least a couple cuts on their feet. And it's because, and like, despite the fact that like, they were being careful and looking down at the ground, I was looking straight ahead and letting my internal monkey brain do that thing. I think most people, for a lot of things, need to be more often allowing their internal monkey brain to just handle it for a lot of things. I'm not going to get too far into all the ways in which I try to use that sometimes. It doesn't always work. Sometimes, like, just becoming aware of it can ruin that kind of thing. But there's a huge degree to which, if you've heard of flow state before, that's what I'm talking about too. It's the same kind of brain pattern that you're doing right there. It's like a flow state. Anyways, moving on. When we open up the plants, we find the state that does the work, and we also find how it is sensitive to the sun's direction in such a way that the plant orients itself appropriately toward the sun. It would be a mistake for philosophers to write to biologists telling them that the internal states that they cite in their texts cannot, as a matter of principle, explain the relational nature of the movements of plants. The same goes for philosophers writing to animal biologists, and we are animals. It is really crazy that we still posit that consciousness is controlling things, when meanwhile unconscious can do so well in so many areas. Similarly, some prior researcher, Dennett, noted in biology, we have learned to resist the temptation to explain design in organisms by positing a single great intelligence that does all the work. We must build up the same resistance to the temptation to explain action as arising from the imperatives of an internal action orderer who does too much of the specification work. Yeah, this idea of the self is very closely affiliated with Western ideas of a authoritarian, controlling God. And I think it's a really good analogy right there. Conscious perceptions are determined by unconscious inferences, mental computations of which we can never be aware and over which we have no control. Unfortunately, however, just when the concept of the physiological unconscious was getting up to steam, the behaviorist revolution hit, and the psychological unconscious went the way of the consciousness itself. Back in the early days of psychology, like early days, Freud and type stuff, they used to do psychology based off of asking people, what do you internally feel like this internal sense of exploration. Behaviorists said, we're cutting that shit out anymore, right? And this was at the time, I think, good. In the long term, probably a shame. It was bad enough to explain behavior in terms of mental states that could not be publicly observed, and so it was doubly bad to explain behavior in terms of mental states that could not even be privately observed. That is a huge thing they hit on with behaviors, and it was great, obviously. But then in another paper by Nisbet and Wilson, that paper they argued that we are only consciously aware of the products of our mental processes and have little or no conscious awareness of the processes themselves. Great way to phrase it. Some other studies suggested that the intention to act always occurred later than preparatory brain activity. The actual part of your brain that does intention tended to activate far later than the actual parts of your brain or parts of your motor system, even that was already up and moving, already doing the action. This was taken as demonstrating that awareness of the decision to move and preparation of that movement was produced by previous non-conscious processes. Another researcher concluded that the experience of conscious intention comes too late to be the proximal initiator of the motor act, although sufficiently close in time to provide support for the intuitive causal account. So the actual activations in the brain that align with you thinking you caused something are happening way too late in comparison to the actual motor movement happening for them to actually be doing any causing. But they are happening just right afterwards, and therefore soon enough that you can kind of trick yourself into thinking, oh, I must have been meaning to do that, even though the action started a split second before the actual I thought that. By the 1990s, there was a growing number of neuroscientists and psychologists questioning the assumed role that consciousness played in our mental life. So, why the long standing and persisting belief that subjective awareness comprises a cognitive agent, internal action orderer, with the capacity to make decisions and control actions, and the awareness of psychological states such as thoughts, attention, perception, intentions, memories? Why do we have this long standing uh, misperception, this lack of understanding of the truth of what's happening in our heads? So, Graziano's attention schema theory provides a possible explanation for this intractable belief in the form of an attention data handling method employed by the brain to ration processing resources. According to this theory, the experience of consciousness arises from the brain's own feedback when monitoring attention, in the same way that the brain constructs a body schema that models interactions from touch, vision, and proprioceptive information to build a virtual model of phantom body, aka like phantom libs when someone's arm is gone, but they can still feel as if they're moving an arm around. Graziano suggests that the brain employs an analogous attention schema that provides our cognitive processes with a high level, albeit imperfect, overview of where attention is distributed and where consciousness is phantom's attention. Unlike Graziano, who considers consciousness as playing an active role in guiding our behavior, we, these authors here, consider subjective awareness to be epiphenomenal in much the same way that the redness of blood is a consequence of the biological mechanism required to deliver oxygen, but not a function in its own right. I'm kind of stuck in between on these two things. I totally believe in most moments it is epiphenomenal, but I'm tempted to think that sometimes we have some shed of control or some shed of high level of awareness of the fact that we are ourselves experiencing our thoughts as an environment, all that stuff, and therefore can perform influence upon it. Our account questions the strong notion of a binary distinction between conscious and non conscious mental systems and suggests the need to reframe the traditional qualitative distinction in favor of a continuum of non conscious processes. Now, to be fair, neuroscience has yet to explain how subjective awareness is generated by brain systems. However, there is compelling evidence from everyday observations, neurology, neurophysiology, and cognitive sciences that demonstrate that the existence and proper functioning of subjective awareness and associated psychological processes is causally dependent on the intactness and interplay of different brain regions. So even though we don't know how subjective awareness is created by the brain yet, it does seem pretty clear that different brain activity is very causal as to that subjective experience, right? Now, breaking it down the most fundamentally of like the ability to experience at all, to me, that still seems like a problem of panpsychism only thing can solve. But as far as the complex parts of it, of actual self awareness and algorithmic understanding and everything, I do think it's totally reasonable at this point to conclude that like the brain is for sure causing all the things that you're experiencing in your head. The current explanatory gap, how neural systems generate mental states, does not of itself provide grounds in the belief that mental processes can direct psychological and corporeal systems. Just because we haven't solved this problem yet does not mean you can jump to like a soul or whatever. Wegner developed a theory of apparent mental causation, which argued that people experience conscious will when they interpret their own thought as the cause of their action. According to the theory, when a thought appears in consciousness just prior to an action, is consistent with the action, and appears exclusive or salient alternative causes of the action, meaning appears without some other obvious cause of the action, we experience conscious will and ascribe our authorship to ourselves for the action. So it's like, it's not unreasonable that we have wrongly concluded that consciousness causes things. I mean, after all, whenever we see our body doing a thing, it tends to happen right after us thinking to ourselves, I'm going to do that thing. And then why wouldn't you conclude, like, oh, first one thing happens, then the next thing happens, they seem to correlate, it must be causation? It's just a falseness of causation. For those who are into time series analysis, I would even say that thoughts Granger cause actions. That's the way you would phrase it. Is they lead it in time, but they don't actually necessarily have a direct causal influence. It could be some other tertiary variable, aka unconscious brain systems. According to Wegner, the evidence that brain stimulation could produce voluntary appearing actions without the actions performed being felt as consciously willed suggests that the brain structures that provides the experience of will is separate from the brain source of action. It appears possible to produce voluntary action through brain stimulation with or without an experience of conscious will, meaning they can use electrodes on your brain and make you do things, like make your arm shoot up or something, without the core, with or without, depending on like what they hit, with or without a corresponding feeling of of me subjectively, I feel like I'm making that arm go up. So let's say they have some electrodes, right? Let's say they have two of them. One of them, they poke a point in your brain and shock it, and it will make your right arm shoot up. The other one, they can poke and prod it, and it will make you feel like you are going to make your right arm shoot up. It will make you say, oh, I totally intended to do that, right? They can poke one at a time or both at a time. They can have just your arm shoot up. They can have just you feel like your arm is going to shoot up and you want it to. They can have both happen at the same time as well. And that seems to suggest that it should not be causal, that your intention, your feeling of wanting to like throw your arm up, there's no way it's causal if they can do that. This in turn suggests the interesting possibility that conscious will is an add-on, an experience that has its own origins and consequences, only loosely coupled with the mechanisms that yield action itself. Indeed, if you think about thinking, there does seem to be something almost involuntary about it. Solutions come to us, for example, not we to them. This is something people just like don't get. I feel like it often enough. You are not your thoughts. Your thoughts just appear in your head. They are part of your environment. They just kind of show up. You don't will them into existence. They kind of appear, and then you wrongly identify with them. That is it for today. Usually I'm an AI channel, but I hope you enjoyed this deep philosophy dive. I am by no means a pro at it, but I hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment, all the YouTube things. Join the Discord to discuss with the dorks. Support me on with that YouTube join button down below if you're so inclined to do so, if you're a big fan and if you can afford to do so. Other options are Patreon, but if you do through YouTube, you will get early access to my videos when they get uploaded, as opposed to when they become broadly available every day. Other than that, yeah, end of video.